Hamlet is complicated, and Shakespeare scholars often see in the play Hamlet evidence that Shakespeare has leveled up. By Hamlet is complex, I don't just mean that the character Hamlet is supplied by Shakespeare with a rich and varied interior life, that Shakespeare's literary representation of that interior life has sparked generations of audiences and readers to explore notions of selfhood and personal identity and interior mental life to a degree that no other literary work had done before. I don't just mean that Hamlet, the character, is complex. I also mean that the text that you will encounter as Hamlet has undergone a lot of transformations from the time that Shakespeare first got his idea to the time that your humble professor decided what you guys should read. The play Hamlet was published not once but twice in Shakespeare's lifetime as pirated versions that Shakespeare himself had nothing to do with. And scholars believe that these versions were probably drawn from the memories of actors who had supporting roles, and so they were kind of iffy. And the two different versions published during Shakespeare's lifetime and one version published after his death don't share the same content. They don't overlap. And one of the amazing fun things about Shakespeare scholarship is just that how much we don't know. Shakespeare was successful in his day, but one reason why he churned out so many plays is because audiences would stop coming to his theater after a couple weeks or a month or so, and he needed fresh material to attract new audiences. Now, his company also performed plays written by other people, but at the time, nobody thought of Shakespeare's work as, this expert literary gem worth preserving. Many people in London could choose to spend their leisure time a lot of different ways, in sporting events, bear baiting, and so forth, and there were other plays they could go to. So for our purposes, we're just going to rely upon the textual decisions made by the good people of the Folger Shakespeare Library, who put together the online text that I'm assigning, in terms of how to mix together the good parts of the various competing versions of Hamlet in order to create an aesthetically pleasing whole worth studying. So, quick plot review. Shakespeare's Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark. His father, the king, dies suddenly, and his mother rather quickly marries the king's brother. And Hamlet learns near the beginning of the play from the ghost of his father that the new king had murdered the previous king, and the job of avenging the king's death falls to his son, Hamlet. Now, Shakespeare, as usual, didn't invent this story. He remixed the story and dramatized it in interesting ways. A 13th century Scandinavian legend has a character named Amleth. The plot of this character has the same basic sort of love triangle. Both the legend and Shakespeare's version have this adult son pretending to be mad in order to avoid being perceived as a threat by the new king. Both versions have the character being mixed up with a young girl who falls in love with him. In both versions, Hamlet and Amleth both kill a courtier who's been spying on him. All those things line up pretty much. But in the source legend, but not in the play that we're going to read, Amleth cuts up the body of this spy and feeds it to pigs, and gets the royal court drunk, pins them to the ground under court tapestries and sets the palace on fire. There's a plot about hiding gold inside hollow sticks, and Amleth successfully woos another woman. He gets a second wife. He's sent out to woo a woman who has a history of killing her suitors, and he ends up winning and ending up with two wives and two fathers-in-law who both want to kill each other. Anyway, the plot actually goes on quite a bit. This character, Amleth, seems to delight in this violence, and he seems to really get what he deserves. But I'm not telling you about the character Hamlet, because that legend contains, secret hidden truths that will help you decode what is really happening in the play Hamlet. The legend does not contain secret hidden answers, secret correct answers that will help you find out what the play Hamlet means. Rather, I'm noting that Shakespeare took a violent and I'd say probably rather unsympathetic character, and by focusing on just one chunk of that extended storyline, was able to construct a completely different and much more intellectual, more thoughtful, more philosophical character who inhabits a very different story, remixing that legend in order to tell a completely different sequence of events, even though the same structure is common to both of them. It's really a brand new character. And it's a story that intellectuals and smart people have pointed to for hundreds of years as being ahead of its time in terms of the psychological realism that we begin to expect from literary characters after the rise of the novel, which was several hundred years after Shakespeare's play. Okay, I mentioned that word novel. Sometimes beginning literature students use the word novel to mean that thing that we are studying in English class. But a play is not a novel, and a poem is not a novel, a short story is not a novel, a textbook's not a novel, a scholarly essay is not a novel. A novel is a long-form literary genre, book length, that tells an extended story of how the protagonist changes over time. It's a chronicle of a sequence of events that unfold to form a coherent narrative, and it's a story that we experience privately in chunks that we process at our own pace, reading and rereading sections as we please, taking breaks whenever we need to. So all this means that a novel is a much more personal and much more extended storytelling experience than a play, which happens, all at once right in front of you in public, at a pace that you, the audience member, can't control. Of course, you can read the script at whatever pace you wish. Shakespeare's characters in Hamlet are so articulate that they achieve the kind of psychological realism that 20th century modernists like to think that they themselves invented in the modern novel. In fact, Freud used Shakespeare in order to illustrate his techniques of psychoanalytical therapy, in part because he expected his readers would be very familiar with the character Hamlet, and therefore the character Hamlet made a good test case for Freud to demonstrate for his reading public what Freud was trying to do when he psychoanalyzed his patients. But we'll see that Hamlet does some pretty dark things, and there is evidence that in the play that Hamlet is sometimes putting on an act. In fact, he says he's going to put on what he calls an Antic Disposition. Antic, you've heard the word antics, crazy things that people do. But regularly, Hamlet crosses the line and doesn't seem to realize just how unhinged he is. That line that he crosses and recrosses, it's fuzzy. Now, I'd say that a good production would really have to honor the ambiguities in the play Hamlet, so that readers and audiences, even audiences who've seen the same production at the same night, audiences can and should disagree with each other about when Hamlet is sane and when Hamlet is mad, because Shakespeare's play is ambiguous about, it contains internal contradictions about when Hamlet is mad, when he's sane, and what exactly, what grasp of sanity Hamlet has. So it's to this complex character Hamlet, who ends up doing reckless things, or evil, or brutal but necessary things, depending on how you look at the things. It's to this morally shape-shifting character that Shakespeare gives speeches that show his intelligence and his deep understanding of grief and friendship and love, loyalty, his appreciation of the art of theater, his understanding of human forgiveness and divine forgiveness. It's all these things that make Hamlet so attractively human, even when the plot requires Hamlet at various points to manipulate and distort each and every one of these good things, these good, beautiful things, in order to serve his desire for revenge. The play Hamlet follows a basic structure that Shakespeare and his contemporaries would have recognized and enjoyed, that we know is the revenge tragedy. Well, what's a revenge play? Well, okay. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. All right. Inigo from The Princess Bride is a sympathetic figure who, consumed by his desire to track down the six-fingered man who killed his father, Inigo finds himself serving reluctantly as a henchman for a comic villain. Now, appreciating Inigo's Montoya's subplot and the twist that happens when the henchman turns on his boss and joins the hero, turning the subplot from tragic to heroic, assuming a basic familiarity with the conventions of the Elizabethan revenge tragedy as part of what makes the Inigo Montoya plot work so well. In general, Shakespeare's audiences would have expected that participants and innocent bystanders would have been caught up in the hero's revenge quest, and that these bystanders would suffer and die, often in gory and spectacular ways. Shakespeare's audiences would have expected disguises and role-playing and subterfuge, and they would have expected the play to present a kind of moral ambiguity that does not tie things up together neatly in a moral bow at the end of the play. They would have expected, think of other tragic heroes you've read about who, in the name of something good, like honor or love or even defense of their private property, people who are tempted too far often fail in spectacular ways. One of my professors, when I was undergraduate, said, literary interpretation is not a list of facts you're supposed to memorize. It's not a list of correct answers you're supposed to spit back. Literary analysis and interpretation is a thing that you do. It's not a bunch of facts that you memorize. Now, I could easily talk for a long time about almost every line in this play, every scene in this play, but it's not because I've memorized some correct version of what each line means. It's because I've read and heard enough plays that I notice things, and I kind of know what questions to ask myself as I'm reading, and I can spot patterns or half patterns that I then have to hunt for the details that will complete the patterns. I know what patterns to look for, and I recognize when a poet has set something up to give me one pattern and changes it, and I kind of know when I've been tricked or when I've been manipulated in cool and interesting ways, and I know when a poet has satisfied my expectations in a really good way. I was once in an historic church with a friend who was trained in the interpretation of religious art, and I was amazed at all the insights he could come up with, seemingly out of thin air as we were looking at a painting. And I were asking, have you been to this church before? Have you seen that painting before? And he had not seen that painting before, but he was interpreting it on the fly, and I was amazed at all the information he could get out of it. And I just assumed he was, like reciting something that he'd memorized. I confess I forget what the painting was. I don't remember any of the details that he gave me. I wasn't looking at that painting in context, in the context of a course where I was trying to make patterns. I was just, wow, this guy is smart. But he could read that painting so well because his experience reading other religious paintings had given him a base of knowledge that I didn't have. And so he had a skill that I hadn't practiced. And it seemed like magic to me. It seemed, what was easy for him to see, the connections that were easy for him to see were impossible for me to see without the shared experience, the years of experience that he had. Now, sometimes the evidence that's clear to the expert is not so clear to the beginner. And the better interpretations of any text will be informed by more evidence. The weaker interpretations, Hamlet is an alien, alien. It's not a ghost, it's a robot in this play. I mean, yeah, maybe, sure, fine, write your own fan fiction if you want. But just because something would be cool if it were true doesn't make it literarily productive in order to explore unless you can point to the evidence on the page. Okay, it's the same with any subject, not just Shakespeare. So developing a habit of looking up unfamiliar words and looking up familiar words, the more of that stuff that you internalize, the readier you are to see those details as parts of patterns and to watch, those details forming parts of systems that are moving parts that interact with each other. Like my friend who hadn't seen that particular painting that we were looking at, but had seen enough other paintings that he was able to draw from that experience. So the more you read Shakespeare and anything, the easier it will be to start finding these patterns. Now, you may never intend to analyze Shakespeare professionally, but as a college student, surely you want to make a living on your ability to think critically, to notice patterns, to weigh alternatives, and to make judgments, and to ask new questions, rather than simply memorizing and spitting back answers to somebody else's questions, answers that you find in your textbooks or on websites, and spitting them back for points. So, scholars have often observed that Shakespeare named his own son Hamlet, and this son Hamlet died when he was about 10. His name, by the way, the baptismal record is actually spelled Hamlet. There was a baker friend of Shakespeare's who was also named Hamlet. So it's jumping to conclusions if we decide there must be some deep connection between the fact that Shakespeare wrote a play called Hamlet and had a son called Hamnet. To be honest, combing through Shakespeare's life, looking for details that correspond to his plays. I mean, Hamlet had a twin sister named Judith. Is Judith like this coded reference to Juliet? So we know so little about Shakespeare's life beyond bits and pieces like the names of his kids. They're legal documents maybe, but there's no diary, there's no personal letters, so we have to really end up imagining Shakespeare's emotional life and what he thought about things and what his hopes and dreams were. What kind of a man he must have been if he were able to write plays like this. But here's the thing. Elizabethans really didn't care that much about an author's personal struggles and an author's personal life. Elizabethans thought that the real authentic writing, the writing that mattered, wasn't the news stories that people drew from their lives. They thought that it was the classics, the Romans, the Greeks, the ancient legends, the established authorities. That was real writing. That was authentic writing. That was the writing that really mattered. And that's really why Shakespeare pulled so much of his work from these ancient sources. It's a very recent, it's an un-Elizabethan notion that an author's personal struggles and personal stories matter. That the kind of thing that our middle school teachers and high school teachers encouraged us to write about and gave us points for writing about our personal thoughts and our personal struggles, it's a very recent notion that those personal stories matter in any sort of way, or that they're any way related to an author's creative output. If Shakespeare hadn't written a damn good play called Hamlet, nobody would care whether he was inspired to write it because of the death of his son Hamlet. And if we suddenly do start caring about such a thing, if we notice something and make that connection, the play that we're studying doesn't suddenly become better simply because we notice a biographical connection. The play doesn't suddenly become more influential or more daring or better crafted just because we can spot a detail in the author's life that somehow corresponds with some detail in the fictional work. So in this class, there are no quizzes where you can get an extra point for throwing in a factually correct detail about Shakespeare's life. If we make a one-to-one connection between some personal event in the author's life and some detail in the literary work, our understanding of the play does not automatically become any more complete. And I would argue that our understanding of the play is not incomplete if we don't explore Shakespeare's biography. So think about it. If someone makes a video about an Olympic athlete who bounced back from an injury or overcame troubles at home, that video, we may like the video, but it doesn't automatically give that athlete more points the next time they compete. So in my capacity as an English professor, I'm just not that interested in the question of what details from Shakespeare's personal life might have inspired him to write these plays. Consider this conspiracy theory about Shakespeare's identity. You know, that a random nobody son of a provincial glove maker can't possibly have lived a life interesting enough to have inspired all these stories. So it must have been one of these other people whose lives we know more about, who were more interesting, that must have written these plays. In my opinion, that kind of a conspiracy theory, it really just dismisses and challenges and diminishes the creative genius of a man who knew human nature so well that he could strikingly humanize characters characters that he took from existing legends and existing stories and made them his own. J.K. Rowling didn't live under a flight of stairs. Her parents weren't killed by an evil wizard. Fiction writers make stuff up. That's what fiction means. So if Hamlet were an artistic failure, then learning what inspired Shakespeare to write it, learning what he intended it to mean, it just wouldn't matter. So we don't have details about Shakespeare's life. We have very few details. But 400 years later, we do have the play Hamlet. And it's a play that's still full of surprises. I learn something new about it every time that I read it. And I'm looking forward to going through this journey with you. Maybe you were forced to read Hamlet in high school, and maybe you gave it a good shot, maybe you didn't. Whatever it is, I'm looking forward to going through this play with you and hearing your reactions.